In this video, I'll present information from Chapter 6 of Human Anatomy and Physiology, 11th edition. This chapter covers bones and skeletal tissues. In particular, I'll be talking about classification of bones, or different classification systems, as well as the gross structures of bones. First, let's classify by the location within the body. So we can have skeleton that is part of the axial skeleton or the appendicular skeleton. Axial would be the axis of the body. It includes the skull, vertebral column, and the rib cage. The appendicular skeleton is the limbs, so upper and lower limbs, and the girdles attaching the limbs to the axial skeleton. We can also classify bones by shape. So you can see here 4 shape categories. Long bones, which are longer than they are wide. This includes many of the limb bones. You can see here humerus is one example. Short bones. These are cube-shaped or somewhat rounded bones, mainly found in the wrist and in the ankle. This is also found sesamoid bones that are formed within tendons. So the patella is a great example of a sesamoid bone, and those count as short bones again. And the example given here is the talus, which is found within that ankle joint. Flat bones are thin, flat, and slightly curved. These include things like shown here, the sternum, but also the scapula, the ribs, and most of the skull bones, in particular the bones of the cranium. And finally, we have irregular bones. They don't easily fit into one of these other categories. They have fairly complex shapes. The vertebrae are a terrific example of this, but hip bones can also fall within that category. So we've now classified by location, axial versus appendicular, as well as by shape, long, short, flat, and irregular. So now let's take a look inside a bone and start looking at some of the gross structures of bone. So first let's look at a long bone. So here again we have a humerus, but you could just as easily look at, say, a femur or a tibia, ulna, etc. And you can see here it's broken into 2 major portions. We have the shaft, and this is the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is that tubular shaft that forms the long axis of the bone. It's going to be compact bone on the outside, so on the edges, surrounding a central cavity called the medullary cavity. So that medullary cavity is important because that is the storage place of much of our yellow marrow. So bone marrow is stored within that medullary cavity. Each end of this long bone is called an epiphysis, so those are the ends of long bones. Again, surrounded by compact bone, but internally, instead of having that cavity, that medullary cavity, they are filled with spongy bone. So spongy bone looks basically like a sponge, unlike the very solid-looking compact bone around it. Additionally, overlying these epiphyses is an articular cartilage. So we can see that down at the bottom in blue, and on top in blue a little bit, but this is a cartilage that covers the epiphyses of long bones, and it helps to eliminate some of the friction involved in those joints. If we look within this epiphysis, you're going to see a very faint line. This is actually something that is left behind from a developmental structure called the epiphyseal plate. So this is the site of growth in developing bone. But eventually it stops growing, and that's what we're seeing here. And it leaves behind this remnant called the epiphyseal line. So that's the remnant in adults. And it's located in between, basically at the connecting point between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Just as a reminder, bones are organs. So let's go back to the definition of organs, and I'll remind you that they're structures consisting of multiple tissues and serving specific functions. With that definition, bone does an individual bone does meet the definition of an organ. So we can say that bone actually includes bone tissue plus nervous tissue, cartilage, fibrous connective tissues. Muscle cells are found in there. Epithelial cells are found in the blood vessels that run through the bones. So there are lots of different tissues, but they're all contributing to the function of that individual bone. And there are 3 levels of structure. We already looked a little bit at the gross structure of bone. This is what we can see with the naked eye. But you can also look at microscopic structure of bone as well as the chemical structure of bone. So here again is a review of the gross anatomy of bone, and in particular the 2 types of bone. So compact bone is going to be found on the outer layer of a bone, and it's going to be dense and it appears smooth and solid. Spongy bone is going to look sort of like a honeycomb, and it's going to be found within a bone. So it's defined by having needle-like projections called trabeculae. So you can kind of see that. That's all these white lines within this spongy substance. And it has a lot of open spaces between trabeculae that are usually filled with either red or yellow bone marrow. As I've mentioned a few times already, that compact bone is going to be surrounding the spongy bone in different types of bone. So here on the left, we have an illustration showing, it looks like the epiphysis of a long bone, where there's spongy bone in the center, there's articular cartilage around the end, and then in between those is the compact bone surrounding it. If we look in a flat bone, remember that's very wide and thin. In this case, we have a surrounding area of compact bone, and in the center is basically sandwiched in the center is spongy bone, also called the diplo. And here, down at the bottom, just in case you missed this before, the trabeculae are all these different projections that basically form the walls of all these spongy layers inside the spongy bone. All right, there are also these hematopoietic tissues in bone. In particular, red bone marrow is the site of hematopoiesis. In newborns, we would find red marrow in long bones, and that's those medullary cavities, as well as the trabecular cavities in all spongy bone. In adults, we find that red marrow only in the trabecular cavities of some spongy bones. So the presence of red marrow is much more limited in adults than it was in a newborn. So in adults, you'll find it in the spongy bone heads of the femur and the humerus, the flat bones of the skull, as well as some flat bones and irregular bones such as the sternum, ribs, clavicles, scapulae, hip bones, and vertebrae. What happens to all that red marrow as we develop? Well, it is replaced by yellow marrow, and it turns out what makes yellow marrow yellow is fat. So yellow marrow is also known as fatty marrow. And one thing that maybe can give you comfort as an adult is that yellow marrow can, in dire circumstances, such as in anemia, so not enough hemoglobin or not enough red blood cells, can actually be converted. The yellow can convert to red and therefore help to replenish the red blood cells that are lacking in anemia. So we have here just hematopoietic tissue, that's the red marrow. You get less and less red marrow as you age, but in emergency situations, yellow marrow can be converted to red to help you boost some red blood cell levels and get you out of that emergency situation. Additionally, bones are covered in membranes. So we've talked about membranes previously in previous videos, and it's true for bones as well. Most of the structures in your body are covered in membranes. So we have 2 major membranes, the endosteum and the periosteum. So the endosteum lines the inside of compact bone. So here we can see this long bone with a medullary cavity in the center. So this is a diaphysis of a long bone. The inner lining of this compact bone is the endosteum, so it's between the compact bone and that medullary cavity. And the outside membrane on that compact bone, so basically layering the outside of the bone itself, is the periosteum. So endosteum lines the inside of compact bone, periosteum lines the outside of compact bone. So if we look a little more closely at the periosteum, you'll see it's a fairly complex structure. It has two layers, so double layered. The first is a fibrous layer. It consists of dense irregular connective tissue, and it's going to include these things called perforating fibers, and we can see those in the illustration. They look sort of like, I don't know, like glue pulling apart in this illustration, and that's what they serve as. They basically serve as a glue, and it connects the periosteum to the compact bone underneath. The second layer of this double-layered periosteum is called the osteogenic layer. So osteo meaning bone, and genic meaning forming, so bone-forming layer. This is the layer of the periosteum that is closest to the compact bone. And it contains osteoprogenitor stem cells. So these stem cells are what is going to replace any lost bone cells and to help with remodeling of the bone as you age and have different experiences. That periosteum contains many nerve fibers and blood vessels, and they actually continue into the shaft through these holes called nutrient foramen. You can see one of those in the illustration, in which a blood vessel is entering into the deep recesses of the bone through that nutrient foramen. So just try and remember that when you see the word foramen, it typically means it's a hole. And often it's a hole through which blood vessels pass, although you'll also see a lot of nerves passing through foramen. And then finally, the periosteum is an anchoring point for tendons and ligaments. So we have basically a periosteum, and then it almost looks like it's continuous when you get to the point of connecting to tendons and ligaments. So the connections between bones and other bones, as well as between bones and muscles. All right, so now we have the endosteum. Again, that's the inner layer, so it's lining the inside of the compact bone. This one's just single layered, so nothing fancy here. And it's going to cover the inner surfaces as well. So if you go into the spongy bone, you're going to find it layering, completely lining all those trabeculae. Additionally, the nutrient foramen through which these nerves and blood vessels pass from outside to inside of the compact bone, they're covered with endosteum, and the medullary cavities, as shown in the illustration, are lined with endosteum. Just like the periosteum, this endosteum is also a membrane that contains osteoprogenitor stem cells. So there are lots of sources of stem cells, which sort of alludes to a future video in which I'll talk about remodeling and repair of bone, which is happening constantly in your body. All right, so now that we've looked at some of these parts, gross parts, let's think about some markings. So bone markings include three different types. We have projections, and projections are going to be outward bulges of the bone surface, and often these serve as sites of attachment for things like muscles, ligaments, and tendons. There can also be depressions. These are going to be groove-like cutouts of the bone surface, and those are often passageways, so things like vessels and nerves, but they can also play a role in a joint. So for instance, a large enough depression, one bone could fit into that depression of another. And finally, they can be openings. So these are holes or canals into the bone. We just looked at the nutrient foramen as an example, and these are passageways for things like vessels and nerves. So here is just a table from your textbook that goes over some of these different markings. So there are a variety of names that you're going to see, and it's helpful if you can categorize them into each of these groupings of markings. So for instance, projections might be named things like tuberosities or crests, trochanters, lines, tubercles, epicondyles, spines, or even processes, depending on where you're looking in the body. We can see these surfaces that help to form joints. Those include heads, facets, and condyles. So here we can see the condylar process on the mandible. And next we can move into depressions and openings. So passages for, say, blood vessels and nerves could be called grooves or fissures, foramen, or notches. And we can also have passageways for other structures, such as a meatus, or a sinus, or even a fossa. So that takes us through some of those bone markings. And so now I just have one question to leave you with. Again, you can look through the textbook to find the answer, but the question is, briefly describe the arrangement of compact bone and spongy bone in flat bones. How is the arrangement different in long bones? So basically, how does the arrangement of compact and spongy bone differ in flat bones versus long bones?